Hey. Today, we're going to be going into your roadmap to writing your very first novel. Where does every road trip start? Home. Where does every story start? With an idea. I have my digital whiteboard here. Every story starts with an idea. That little spark of inspiration that gets you going. I remember the story of J.K. Rowling, the spark of inspiration that gave her the initial idea, that seed for what became Harry Potter. She was riding a train and just had this kind of vision or idea in her head of these three kids on the train. That was the initial spark. That was the idea. I recommend what you do is get yourself one of those little flip over notepads or just a notepad that you can carry with you and some pens, and anything that pops into your head that could be an interesting story. Write it down. You never know what might be that little bit of inspiration that makes you go, yeah, this is my story. But of course, you can always use AI for brainstorming. Just to help you out. And the way you use it is, it's not that difficult. You do a prompt like, give me some ideas, some story ideas for fantasy with these three elements. Something, and it'll give you a whole bunch of ideas based on what you ask it to give you ideas for. And you go through and you pick and choose things out that you like and ignore everything else. And you use that to build out an idea. So, once you have an idea, what comes next? Fleshing the idea out. Now, this is kind of where you take that initial seed and start building it. You start growing it. And you do that, I find what works best for me, and it's a good method, I find, is simply asking yourself questions. It's like, who is this character going to be? Who is the villain? Where is this going to take place? You don't need a lot of detail at this point. You're just, random name generators to get names. Just little bits of details. Just some things to flesh it out. To get an idea of what the story is going to be. A very rough overview of the story. That's all you're looking for at this stage. Okay? It's kind of like the idea is deciding to go on a road trip. I'm going to write a story. This is the idea for the story. We're going to go on a road trip. Let's start planning our road trip. Fleshing things out is kind of deciding what direction the road trip is going to take. Okay? Next step in the road trip of writing your first novel, short story novella, is building characters. I find that it is excruciatingly important, highly important, to build your characters early in the process. Start building them early. And again, it's just a process of deciding who they're going to be, giving them a name, adding a few details, and then adding to those details over time. But I think it is vitally important because the characters are what the reader cares about. Okay? The characters, they want to see what happens to the characters next. Is basically the goal of every author, is to create a situation, characters in that situation, and make the reader go, I want to find out what happens next. That is always going to be your goal. You want to tell a story, yes, but if you want people to read the story, that is kind of the tried and true, time-honored, tested way to get people to engage with your story and care about it, is by making them care about the characters and what's going to happen to those characters. So I find, again, that fleshing out your characters and getting that process started early, it helps tremendously. After that, we get into plot outline. if I spell things correctly. Now, there are so many resources available for doing plot outlines. There's so many different methods. My method is fairly simple. I like to start with where I'm starting, the initial starting point of the story, and the finale, the ending of the story. And once I have those two things, it's a matter of filling in the steps along the way. Okay? But the reason why I want you to consider doing your outlining first before world building, which is the next step, is because your world building really should serve the plot. And in order for that to work, you need to have an idea of what the plot is. You know, your road trip needs a map, basically. If you're going to visit locations along the way, you need to know where you're going and how you're going to get there. That's your plot outline. And then once you have an outline, you can get into world building. This is where you put in your points of interest along the trip. Or you decide where the characters are going to go and what they're going to do when they're there. That's part of the plot, but you know, once you know where the characters are going to be going and what they're going to be doing there, it's much easier to actually build those elements. Okay? You know, you don't need to do 50 different locations if your characters are only going to visit 5. You're doing 10 times as much work for nothing. You might use it later, but there's no reason to build those things until later. So, do your world building to serve the plot. It saves you a tremendous amount of headaches and time and will help you avoid things like info dumping. You can run into the same problem with over building your characters, but you know, you should always avoid info dumping of any kind, but also avoid wasting a huge amount of time on things that will never make it into the story. And often, like, if you're trying to get published by a publisher, they're going to make you cut that stuff anyway. You know, if they decide to pick up the book, the novel, they will make you cut out all but just very necessary little bits and pieces of both character backstory and world building. So you have to be careful about that stuff. And one of the ways I've found that helps keep me on track is, again, I do the plot outlining first and then worry about the world building afterwards. It works. Lastly, you actually do your writing. As a writer, yeah. Because in a very real way, writing is the journey itself. Whereas getting your idea, fleshing out the idea, building your characters, plot outline, and world building, that is your planning. Starting to write without doing your planning first is like going on a road trip without doing any planning beforehand. You're going to get lost. You're going to get sidetracked. You're not going to know where you're going. You're going to get into situations where you don't know how to get out of them. It ends up being a mess. It stops being a vacation and becomes a hassle, a problem. And you give up when you're writing a story. You know, if you try to go on a vacation without doing any planning ahead of time, there's a strong tendency to just turn around and go home because it turns into more hassle than it's worth. Same thing happens with writing. So, your roadmap to writing your first novel is to actually map it out first before you start writing. Get all the prep work out of the way, and then writing becomes much, much easier. If you would like a more in-depth, actionable guide in order to do that, I have a workshop available, the Organic Writing with AI workshop, that goes into all of this in good detail and actionable details. It's not like a bloated 500-page document about this stuff. Very clear, actionable steps with exercises that will help you go from nothing to having an idea to completing a novel. I put a lot of work and my own experiences into this workshop to make it the best workshop it can be for you, to save you a lot of hassle and headaches. So check it out, link in the description. Thank you very much for watching. See you on the next one. Later.